I think what all of this war shows is that the UN is really in a damaged state when it comes to war and peace because of the way that the Security Council functions. And I have my modest proposal taken from the principles of the Catholic Church, and that is that we should lock them in a room, the 15 members, and tell them that they cannot come out until there's white smoke over the 38th floor and they have negotiated an end to this war. That's their job. They're not doing their job at all, not even remotely doing their job, not even seeing it as their job. And that is really a dire warning for the world, actually. It is the job of the UN Security Council to negotiate. But what I've observed is there are no negotiations. There's only speeches to the camera right now. And it's only taken as a game for the news cycle. It's not discussions. It's not negotiations. And it is very dangerous that it operates like that.
Is there any international institution left which could function as a forum which is accepted by all the warring parties? I mean, the UN is definitely out of the question. The loss of credibility, according to me, is huge due to this behavior you just described. But is there any international institution left that could fix this terrible situation?
No, but what there is a phone call between Biden and Putin that could end this. And I keep offering to give them a Zoom link if they want to talk to each other. They could borrow my cell phone. The biggest disappointment of, well, maybe that's a strange way to put it, a profound reality of this war is that since February 24th, 2022, Putin and Biden have not spoken one time, not even one time. All they have to do is send a Zoom link. They could talk with each other, even if they disagree. This is unbelievably irresponsible of Biden, first of all, in my opinion, but of the two, talk with each other. That's all. Disagree, yell at each other, but talk with each other, because you can't end the war without talking. And this is a war between the US and Russia. Of course, it's the Ukrainians dying, but this is a war between the US and Russia.
In one of your podcasts, very impressive, about the Kennedy speech, the peace speech you mentioned before, you said that the one crucial element was that Kennedy and Khrushchev were talking to each other. They installed even this telephone line. I have a photograph of that telephone here in my office, the most communication device of humanity. If I take this, I get the impression that we have a tremendous leadership crisis, especially in the West. We have a leadership in the West who is living in a way of a bunker or in a cave, where they seem to be hypnotized by their own images of the other side, of the enemy, and they start to believe their own cave paintings in their caves, you know, to use this metaphor.
Yes.
And a lot of friends of mine and colleagues say we really have a leadership crisis in the West. And can you comment on that? I mean,
I can. If you give me a moment, let me get a book down off my shelf. Hold on.
Of course, of course.
This book is called the Kennedy-Khrushchev Letters. Mm-hmm. When Kennedy became president, Khrushchev sent him a congratulatory note, and Kennedy proposed, why don't we open a back channel communication in text? It wasn't with the phone yet, and we'll write to each other, and I promise you Chairman Khrushchev, I will never make public anything, and only a few of my closest aides will see this. So we'll keep it very much just for myself and a few absolute close aides, and you can do the same, but let's have a channel of communication. And these letters are astoundingly interesting and important. There are a large number of them. I don't remember the count. More than 100 of these. And they're incredible to read. For example, I was just reviewing after the U.S. invaded Cuba in the Bay of Pigs in April 1961, Khrushchev wrote in the back channel to Kennedy, rogue elements of your government are committing acts of piracy in your name, and Mr. President, you need to stop this. And Kennedy wrote back a disgraceful letter, actually, one of the worst of his career, in my view. Mr. Khrushchev, this has nothing to do with us. This isn't really the United States, so don't misinterpret. And Khrushchev wrote, so that was on April 18, I think it is. And then Khrushchev wrote back, basically, to paraphrase, Mr. President, don't ever lie to me like that. This is an American action, and don't talk to me like that. And you need to stop this international crime. And first of all, very human letters. Khrushchev sending the alarm, Kennedy brazenly lying, Khrushchev responding, don't you dare lie to me. And they were off and running. And it was that relationship, actually, that saved the world in the end, because they were really talking with each other, sometimes deeply arguing. And of course, at the Vienna summit in 1961, Kennedy had a hard time as Khrushchev really pounded on him. But they regarded each other as human beings and able to talk with each other. And that makes a big difference in this world. And one of the absolute worst ideas, disgraceful ideas of American rhetoric is you can't talk to a person like Putin. That's like Munich 1938. So Munich 1938 supposedly teaches America never negotiate with the other side. That's appeasement. And that is actually one of the beliefs, deep beliefs in this fantastical American foreign policy, which is even talking is a terrible, terrible appeasement. And
but this strikes me as completely absurd because, I mean, the Americans, the Germans, they were talking to the Soviets. And whatever you can say about Putin, I mean, the Soviet Union had a gulag. The Soviet Union had
of course, Stalin. And they not only were they talking, they were making,
but they were still talking to them.
They were making arms agreements.
Soviets, if you talk to Mao, you can talk to Putin. Putin is compared to a Mao. Putin is like a Nobel Peace Prize winner compared to a guy like Mao or Stalin. And I mean, they were collaborating. They were working together against Hitler.
Exactly. No, it's just, it's so immature, so misguided. And I see it all around me. And by the way, it leads to all these useless wars. Yeah. So it's not as if there are no consequences. The consequences are before our eyes. Yeah. This is no way to have diplomacy. That's what I was trying to tell these people in the White House. Behave. If you behave, you can avoid the war.
But at the end of the day, one has to say, to bringing in a fair account of events, I share a lot of your views, basically all of them. But one thing strikes me still. I think that Putin, there was a certain sense of recklessness. He thought he could get away with it as well. When he saw the Americans running in Afghanistan, he saw in Berlin. There is a new government with inexperienced people. Putin doesn't take seriously Macron in France. Probably Putin extremely underestimated this kind of woke response, this kind of woke foreign policy, this emotional foreign policy that the whole West, or basically, I mean, the Americans, would strike back so hard that they would defend the Ukraine. Don't you see a certain sense of megalomania on the side of Putin as well when he went into the Ukraine?
No, I wouldn't say megalomania, but what I would say is that each side is playing a game of chicken, and each side has underestimated the response on the other side. Yeah. Because the U.S. thought it could get away with everything just in 2014. It would be enough to throw Yanukovych out, and now we'll have a pro-Western government, and we'll do everything we want to do. They miscalculated. Putin grabbed Crimea. Then in 2021, Putin thought massing the troops on the border would be enough to get Biden to negotiate. By the way, it should have been. There was because the terms for the negotiation were perfectly plain and reasonable, but it didn't work. Then Biden thought, okay, it's a bluff. Putin will not do this. Okay, Putin then called the bluff, thinking, you know what, we'll force them to the negotiating table. And interestingly, within days, Zelensky was at the negotiating table.
He was tweeting about neutrality in
exactly
last April. Zelensky was tweeting.
No, but as early as exactly as early as March, just a few days after the start. So that was Putin's idea. Okay, then Biden said, no. The sanctions will kill them. And so I remember I spoke to people in the U.S. Treasury. Oh, it's going to be devastating, you know. So they thought that would blow off Putin. Each side has been doing this. Then, you know, they thought, okay, Putin will never mobilize politically, the backlash and so forth. Then he mobilized a few 100,000 additional troops in the summer of 2022. So this is a game of chicken with escalation. And the fundamental problems with it are what Obama noted in 2014, which is Russia has escalatory dominance, which is that for Russia, this is existential. For the United States, it's incidental. And so this is the fundamental problem with the Western position. And that's why we're in a disaster. And the biggest puzzle in all of this is, for me, it's not even a puzzle anymore, but it's the biggest tragedy is Ukraine doesn't have the wherewithal to recognize that it needs to save itself from this game of these two escalating superpowers.
Is President Zelensky, who is almost depicted as a saint in our media, isn't Zelensky an extremely irresponsible leader of his country?
He will be regarded in history as a disaster. Absolutely.
Yeah. It's interesting that at the moment it's the total opposite, but I notice the atmosphere is changing. People are losing a bit their patience with him. But I mean, I took so much time of you, but I would like, if you allow me, if
Zelensky had just followed through in March 2022, he would have done his job for his country. But the United States intervened and said, no, don't make that agreement. And he went with the U.S., and that's where he failed.
Allow me to put the global perspective to the last part of the interview. I don't want to take too much of your precious time, but it's so interesting. Do we enter a new chapter in current history? Meaning 30 years ago, the fall of the Iron Curtain, globalization, free trade, an explosion of wealth, development of backwater countries. I mean, you are a development economist. A lot of countries gained a lot of wealth due to this interconnectivity or whatever you want to call it. And now we are entering what I would call an absurd version of a Cold War.
Mm-hmm.
Is that ahead or is that hyperbole?
We don't know what kind of world we're entering yet. What I believe is that the underlying reality is we're already in a post-American and post-Western world. We're in a truly multipolar world. We're in a world where the BRICS countries are larger than the G7 countries.
Even Turkey wants to join. Even Turkey and
yes.
Greece want to join the BRICS countries.
So, in my view, we've already moved to a world in which the underlying economic, demographic, and technological capacities mean that this is not the world of the 19th and 20th century dominated by the West, but this is a bigger world with multiple major powers in it. And one of the points of all of this is the United States does not accept that transition. The United States still believes that this is ultimately a US-led world with two recalcitrant actors, Russia and China, and all the rest will come along to understand the realities. And the US, in my opinion, is a quarter century out of date. But being at the institutions of American power, Harvard and the East Coast of the U.S., I know what people say and think and talk, and I think they're just a quarter century out of date. So that is our big geopolitical challenge, is that the mental models of the major powers and the realities are not aligned. And Europe is a big disappointment in this, because there isn't one voice in Europe right now that has a geopolitical outlook that is really even intelligible, basically. So this is, to me, both natural, that this is a war that shows the limits of American power, which are not the world leader, but a very powerful country among many, or among a few at least. And the biggest surprise is the incapacity of Europe to have a coherent understanding of the situation. But what kind of world we're heading towards really is an open question, because we could be heading towards a world of massive conflict and disaster, or we could actually head towards a world where some intelligent, non-octogenarian leader in the United States arises and says, you know, NATO, we don't need it so much anymore. But what we do need is to have normal relations with China, with India, with Russia, with Brazil, with the EU. And then suddenly things would look really quite different. So where we're heading is not, I believe, either set in stone or even easily predictable. We have this geopolitical crisis. We have a technology disruption, which is profound. We have an ecological disruption, which is profound. And how we manage this is the biggest question. And the war in Ukraine is a tragic sideshow to the big issues. But in a way, I sometimes compare it to the Battle of Teutoburg Forest in 9 AD. Augustus learned in 9 AD, okay, the Roman Empire, it's big, but we don't have to actually go all the way into Germania. Maybe we'll just stop here. And it's a good lesson, by the way, because the Roman Empire did quite well for centuries onward without having to continue to try to conquer the German tribes. And I think this is kind of a Teutoburg forest for the US, or should be seen as one, which is okay. That's the limit of NATO enlargement. These are the new limits. This is the lines of Europe now. It extends through Eastern Europe, but it doesn't go across to Moldova, Belarus, Ukraine, and so on. And now let's learn to live in such a world.
What do you say to people who describe the situation right now as a global conflict between democracies and autocracies, and China being the ultimate enemy of the West?
When I first heard that, I regarded it as worse than a kindergarten story. I could not believe a president of the United States would say such an idiotic thing. To see that it's part of actual U.S. foreign policy discourse is to show what I think the failings of American higher education are. But it could not be stupider. Period.
Yeah. And let's talk.
Am I being clear?
Yeah. Let's talk for a moment about the United States. I mean, we read a lot of disquieting news. For example, you have a lot of homeless people in some cities. You have an explosion, it seems, of criminality. You have infighting in the political class, extremely divided, the Democrats against the Republicans. What is your assessment of the United States? In what shape are the United States at the moment, which still, I have to say, I mean, I've spent a lot of time in the US, and the US has always been an inspiration for Swiss people, of course, for our family. But still, there are some disturbing news one reads. But what is your impression as an American and insider?
Basically, for the last 40 years, the U.S. has not been able to reach any kind of social democratic agreement on any issue of society's problems. So by that I mean what happened roughly 40 years ago. The U.S. political system was completely hacked by lobbying and campaign contributions, and the Supreme Court opened the doors to the massive corruption of the U.S. political system. So all of our politics are in the hands of powerful groups. Finance is in the hands of Wall Street. The healthcare sector is in the hands of the big health insurance industry. The energy sector is in the hands of big oil to a very large extent. The foreign policy is in the hands of the military-industrial complex. It's all been parceled out. And the problem is not polarization in between red and blue states. It's not the tribal divisions between the Republicans and the Democrats. Basically, both parties serve their campaign financiers. They're the same for both parties. We're pretty deeply entrenched in all of our politics right now. Nothing changes year to year. And the social conditions underlying the society have deteriorated markedly over the last 30 years, predictably. And the best gauge of that deterioration is that our life expectancy now is around the level of 1996. So we've had a decline of several years of life expectancy. It's 76 years, according to the most recent calculations. And that shows a society that is really in bad political health as well as social health. And I live in New York City. It's filled with garbage and homelessness right now. I mean, just the management of the city on a daily basis is a much bigger challenge than it was 20 years ago. And it's obvious the things to do because Europe does most of them, and the United States can't do anything because the rich people who pay for the government don't want to pay taxes, and that's the end of the story. So it's we're just paralyzed in this. And when the Democrats are in office, nothing happens, and when the Republicans are in office, nothing happens, and that's really where we are on our social politics. And it's not red and blue states. That's a kind of game of daily social media. It's very uninteresting, the politics, actually. It's very clear, very predictable, and very much hacked.
What do you think of Donald Trump? I mean, is he a man who could make America great again, or is he a danger for American democracy?
Look, Biden is a danger for American democracy. Trump is a danger for American democracy. What are we doing with octogenarian leaders right now? Period. I'm aghast at the Biden administration. I was aghast at the Trump administration. I was profoundly disappointed with the Obama administration. I was absolutely aghast at the Bush Jr. administration. During my whole lifetime, there's been one president that I think bears high respect, and that's John Kennedy. And he made his early blunders, and then he became a great man, and then they killed him. And beyond that, Johnson, no thank you. Nixon, no thank you. Gerald Ford, Jimmy Carter's very nice man, very not effective. Ronald Reagan, no thank you. George Bush Sr. had his moments and then dropped the ball. Clinton was really so amateurish and dilettantish in governance. George Bush Jr. was a disaster. Obama was, those 8 years went by and nothing happened. He was, you felt he wouldn't do something completely awful, and he didn't. He was level-headed, but didn't lead to any change because the system is just blocked. Trump, completely unstable, and Biden, an octogenarian neocon. You know, what more could you want?
What does it say about the American political system that you have still in the polls a highly rated former president who is attacked by attorneys, who is involved in a whole array of criminal law, criminal cases? I follow this, from a lot of distance, but I think it's always a bit a dangerous symptom if political fights are, fought on the courts, that they start
to attack. Of course.
How do you assess that? I mean, what does it stand for? What kind of
what it means? The main thing is Americans do not trust their institutions anymore. That's the dominant fact. Americans do not trust their institutions. And the reason is government operates by lies. And that's terrible. And if you do that pervasively, you end up with the Congress with a trust rating of 10% of the public, something like that. And this collapse of trustworthiness started with the assassination of President Kennedy and the lies that were told about it. And then it was followed by Watergate and Vietnam War and one war after another based on lies. And so the American people are deeply unhappy. The political system has proven to be corrupted and unable to reform itself. And the main lesson I would take from this is don't have a presidential system, by the way. You have a parliamentary system. At least you get the parties have to discuss with each other and negotiate something, and it's a little bit more stable than what we have.
Do you think that the relationship between Russia and Europe is now destroyed for a very long time, or can that be repaired in a foreseeable future?
Not only can it be repaired, it will be repaired. And it's a tip of, I want to read one more of my favorite lines from Kennedy. When Kennedy spoke at the Irish Parliament in July 1963, he said, "Indeed, across the gulfs and barriers that now divide us, we must remember that there are no permanent enemies. Hostility today is a fact, but it is not a ruling law. The supreme reality of our time is our indivisibility as children of God and our common vulnerability on this planet." And this is very wise. There are no permanent enemies. Russia's not going away. It's 11 time zones. It's a major power in the world. It is a trading country. It is a European country. It is part of European culture and history. And all that's said right now, for example, the New York Opera canceling a Russian soprano because of the war. This is happening, but it's mindlessly stupid, and it will be short-lived. And it's important to remember that in the Crimean War, and this is the second Crimean War, it's just the second Crimean War. In the first Crimean War, which ended in 1856, by 1871, pretty sure it's by 1871, France and Russia were allies again because of the rise of Germany. And so, time to change partners again. And so what had been this, dramatic fight in Palmerston wanted to end Russia and dismember Russia. Soon, France and Russia were allies, and France was pumping finance into Russia again. So this is not the end of anything, of course, and it should come back much sooner than people think.
A bit out of context, a very short question. How do you interpret this coup in Niger? What is this about? Is this a new kind of what is it? An African awakening, or what is it? Is it just a local event? Or?
I think it is. It is clearly three things. One is it's poverty, because the Sahel is impoverished, and impoverished places where I've been working for more than 40 years, they're unstable. And so this is, and I have always said, by the way, the number of speeches I've given to say, we need a program for the Sahel, to help water, food, and so forth. Okay, so that's one part. Second, it's clearly, the end of the French role. We're still in the final waves of decolonization in West Africa, and remaining French privileges are going to be pushed aside. It took longer time because of the poverty, basically. But this really is an anti-colonial action, and it finds a lot of support on the street, definitely. And you see it, that it's not just Niger, it's Burkina, it's Mali, and it's anti-French for sure.
A good sign, a good, in that sense, a good development.
It is what happened in every part of the world, but it's happening later in Africa because the dependency was higher, the poverty was higher. And then the third part is it quickly became, within 2 days, new geopolitics because of Wagner and Russia and everything else. So it's dangerous. And what the right answer to this, actually, which I uselessly proposed this immediately, was, how about an economic development program for the Sahel? God forbid people should live with the chance of, with some chance. And as usual, nobody, and I will push this in the UN for whatever it's worth, but the normal response is this has nothing to do with that. This has, where the army is going to be, will ECOWAS intervene? If you want, it doesn't even matter right now who's in charge. It doesn't matter really how the politics is. What matters is these are places of hunger, of drought, of lack of infrastructure, of lack of schooling, of no budgets, and we should do something about it because people should not live in that condition.
You have just spent, I think, 1 year in Europe, in Vienna, and
yes.
in some other places. What is the most important take you have from this stay in Europe? What's your dominant impression of the state of Europe?
I was very disappointed because most of Europe's leaders are right now simply following whatever the United States says. And whether this is because of their belief in Europe's security, whether it's their belief that the US will punish them if they deviate from the line, the state of European politics is quite bad. And the war has made things worse because Europe is with a dominant narrative like the United States that is basically given by the US security establishment and then repeated in the mainstream media in Europe. So it was, at a political level, really disappointing. At a personal level, it was wonderful. Vienna is a fantastic place. It is the result of decades of social democratic philosophy and ethos and social housing, and we had a fabulous time. And I also came to admire more and more the wise decision of both the Soviet Union and Austria in 1955 to make a very good deal, that the Soviets would leave Austria and the Austrians would declare neutrality, and that this would be the basis going forward. And it proved its great worth, and I tried to sell that approach for free to give the advice to Ukraine repeatedly, but they didn't understand that it's much better to be a neutral Austria than a NATO aspirant partner of the United States. As Henry Kissinger famously said, to be an enemy of the United States is dangerous, but to be a friend is fatal. And Ukraine has believed that the U.S. is going to provide security, and what the U.S. is providing is the dismemberment of Ukraine.
Your Austrian neutrality makes us Swiss a little bit proud, because in the constitution of Austria it says they want to have a neutrality Swiss style.
Oh, I didn't realize that.
Yeah. I mean, that Switzerland was the role model for neutrality in Austria. What's your relationship with Switzerland?
And this is, Switzerland, of course, extremely smart, and it served Switzerland very well. It served Austria very well, and ironically, it served Sweden and Finland very well. And they abandoned this this year, shockingly naively, thinking that Russia's about to invade Finland or Sweden. No. And all of the benefits of neutrality they gave up overnight because of these right-wing parties that don't understand or pretend not to understand the current geopolitics.
Even in Switzerland, there are people in the establishment who think that neutrality has to be given up, or neutrality has to be made more flexible, that Switzerland can deliver weapons to one party in the war. What do you say about that? I mean, as a yeah, what's your take on that? I mean, should Switzerland give up neutrality? Would that be a wise course?
No, there's nothing more to add. Switzerland's one of the most successful countries of modern history. Why would you give up the basis of success?
Ja, as Goethe said, nichts ist schwerer zu ertragen als eine Folge von guten Tagen. Good days are hard to bear, and sometimes if you're very successful, you start to forget what made you successful.
Well, it's interesting. Every day I walk by Goethe in on the Ringstrasse in Vienna because he's got a big statue just near the opera house, and so I paid respect to Goethe every day.
Okay. You have been commenting, of course, the war in Ukraine in the recent months extensively. How do you assess the situation at the moment? Give us a brief oversight of your perception.
I think it's probably accurate or roughly accurate that about 40,000 Ukrainians have died in the last 2 months of what is a failed counteroffensive promoted by the United States. So this has been a disastrous period. Ukraine will not achieve on the battlefield its goals. This was clear from the very beginning, but the U.S. has always said otherwise. And remember, I'm 68 years old, so I've heard the fairy tales of U.S. generals for more than 6 decades. They always say, yes, success is just around the corner. This next offensive is going to be great. The surge is going to be decisive, and so forth. So I've heard this so many times in Vietnam, Cambodia, Laos, Nicaragua, Iraq, Syria, Libya, and heard it again in Ukraine. What's very sad is that Ukraine is being destroyed in this process because the U.S. has wanted to push Ukraine to NATO, and Russia, for completely predictable and understandable reasons, said no. And the United States believed that Russia was bluffing, or that if not bluffing, that it had no alternative but to bend to the U.S. will. And this has not been the case. And Biden is not a very clever man, unfortunately, and his team is not very clever. Obama was more clever than Biden. And Obama knew in 2014, though Obama helped to start this disaster when the U.S. helped to overthrow Yanukovych, Obama knew at that time, don't go deeper into this. Because, as he said in an interview, Russia has escalatory dominance. Whatever we do, Russia will escalate. And the reason is, for Russia, this is existential. For the United States, it's nice. Wouldn't it be nice if Ukraine were in NATO? We would control the Black Sea. That's nice. But for Russia, it's absolutely existential. And so Obama already understood in 2014, don't escalate because Russia will continue to escalate. You can't bluff Russia out of this. Biden, who's not very clever, just thought, well, what will Putin do? We'll just keep pushing. And when Putin put on the table in December 2021 a draft agreement for security arrangements between the U.S. and Russia, by the way, I called the White House to say, negotiate. This is absolutely negotiable. I was told, no, we're not going to negotiate. And the U.S. told Russia, no, not interested in negotiating. NATO is none of your business. It was literally the line. And Putin said, it is my business, and has shown it. And this is a complete disaster for Ukraine. Probably the population has declined by maybe 10 million from emigres on the one hand, or the Russia-controlled territory on the other hand. And the bloodbath continues. And NATO has, I won't even say NATO, this is a small group in the U.S. leadership. They have no answer but they have the election coming up in November 2024. So they think they need to continue this so as not to show weakness or defeat. This is where we are right now. It's a complete tragedy for Ukraine.
How will it play out? I mean, it's always hard to say, of course, to look into the future, but what is the most probable outcome you see in this war?
There will be ongoing large-scale killing and destruction until honesty prevails, and honesty will mean that the U.S. will be clear that NATO enlargement to Ukraine is not going to take place and not going to happen, and it's not an objective, and then the fighting will stop. And when the fighting stops, there will be major territorial issues. One, I think, was fated from the beginning, and that is that Crimea will remain in Russian hands, as it was and has continued to be Russia's naval base in Sevastopol since 1783. It's not going to Ukraine, other than it's not going to Ukraine, period. And then the issues of the Donbass and Kherson district and Zaporizhia. This is really a mess right now, because in December 2021, we should remember Russia was making no territorial claims, even for the Donbass. What Russia was calling for was honoring the Minsk agreements. And the US stupidly and Ukraine stupidly wouldn't honor agreements that had been signed and backed unanimously by the UN Security Council. Well, Russia is now dismantling the country geographically, and with so many losses on the Russian side, the belief that, well, okay, we'll just go back to where we were is a little naive. So this is a mess. I don't have any clear answer. What I've said every day from December 2021 until now is sit down and negotiate, because it's getting worse. And in the meantime, Ukrainians are dying at a rate of maybe 1,000 a day right now, or 1,000 dead and seriously wounded. And this is absolutely disastrous.
The dominant narrative, even in Switzerland, in the German-speaking part of Europe, I don't know, probably also in the United States, is that Putin is trying to reassemble the Soviet Union. His plan is to create a greater Russia, and to negotiate with Putin would be appeasement policy, which was doomed against Hitler. These historical analogies are being made. Why is this narrative wrong in your eyes?
Well, because the real context is that the American empire is the one that keeps expanding, or the intention of it. And by, that's a provocative phrase that Americans are not allowed to say. But the American military alliance, NATO, is the active agent here of expansion. And this counters all that was said to Gorbachev in 1990. It's a direct violation of common sense, as well as commitments that were made back in 1990, that as the Soviet Union dismantled the Warsaw Pact, NATO would not take advantage of that in any way. And of course, the famous expression was not 1 inch eastward. Mm-hmm. And as soon as the Soviet Union ended, I was actually in the room in the Kremlin when that happened, because I was advisor to Boris Yeltsin. So this is, for me, not only history books, but being there. The United States, unbeknownst, of course, to me and to the world at the time, because everything is done secretly, said, okay, now we start expanding NATO. And from the early 1990s onward, this was set in motion. And our top diplomats warned repeatedly, don't do that. Our greatest diplomat of the age, George Kennan, after all, the author of Containment itself in 1947, said, do not expand NATO. Our Secretary of Defense at the time, William Perry, said, do not do this. Our ambassador to the Soviet Union, Jack Matlock, a wonderful diplomat, said, do not do this. This will start us down a path of new confrontation. What's interesting is that for the first few years, the first wave of expansion, Poland, Hungary, and the Czech Republic, I think Russia was very unhappy, but said, okay, that's Central Europe. But then the next swath under George W. Bush Jr. was, of course, right against the Black Sea, Bulgaria, Romania, the Baltic states, Slovakia and Slovenia, 7 in one wave. The Russians said, stop this already. And Putin went to the Munich Security Conference in 2007. People should read the speech. Of course, not only do they not read the speech, our mainstream media absolutely tried to deflect us from any history, from any memory, from any context. But Putin said, stop expanding. You promised us no expansion. Now you keep expanding. And this is extraordinarily dangerous for our national security, what you're doing. So what was the U.S. response? In 2008, George W. Bush Jr. insisted that NATO will go not only to Ukraine, but to Georgia. Okay, now it turns out this was part of a timeline that was already deeply set. This wasn't just George W. Bush Jr., though he didn't have to follow through. Zbig Brzezinski explained all of this in Foreign Affairs magazine in 1997 in an article called Strategy for Eurasia. He even gave the timetable. He said Ukraine's membership will come between 2005 and 2010. And if you're experienced in US politics, an article in Foreign Affairs like that is not just some author's thinking. It's a reflection of what is in train. Little bit trial balloon, but mainly explanation of the timeline. Now, in 2008, European leaders were aghast at what Bush had done. And some of them talked to me. And they told me.
Angela Merkel.
Not Angela Merkel personally, no.
But she said at the time, if Ukraine would be part of NATO, this would be a cause for war for Russia. Even Merkel said it.
Exactly. So this was all known. And what is so sad about the European leaders is none of them tells the truth right now. They're all so scared of the United States or of their public or of the ability to manipulate the mass media and the perception from below or to speak out of line. But I know what they said because they said it to me. They said it to me personally. And by the way, just as recently as a few weeks ago, one of Europe's top leaders, I said to him, I won't go farther to say who, but I said, the day Biden says NATO's not enlarging, then we really can get to the end of the war. And he said to me, I agree with you completely. And then he said exactly the opposite the next day, by the way, in public. So I know it from my own view. So this story, just to finish the story, the disaster, the fuse was lit in 2008, but then the U.S. cannot stop playing games. That's the biggest problem. U.S. foreign policy is covert. It's not that you can't figure it out, but it's secret, it's deniable. And so what happens in 2014 in February? The United States together with right-wing nationalists in Ukraine, worked together to overthrow Yanukovych. Clear as can be. And not only that, thanks to the services of Russia, we even have it on tape with Victoria Nuland talking to U.S. Ambassador Jeffrey Piat about who the next government will be. Basically 4 weeks before Yanukovych is violently overthrown. And they pick the next prime minister and explain why. It can't be Klitschko, it's got to be this one. And it just went down that way. And our newspapers, oh, they won't say a word about it. It's on tape. Oh, that doesn't matter. We can ignore it. We can ignore everything. So that's when the explosion came. The war started with the overthrow of the Yanukovych government. Now, oh, so many people, Sachs, what a Putin apologist, what a conspiracy theorist. Of course, people, if you don't look a little bit or people don't tell you things, then you don't know. But let me advise people, just for example, there's a very nice book written by a very fine scholar in 2017 called Covert Regime Change. And it's about U.S. foreign policy from 1947 to 1989. And it documents 64 covert regime change operations of the U.S. government. So that's the business of the U.S. government, overthrowing other governments. They're called covert, but there's a lot of trace. I've been actually in places where governments have been overthrown. I watched, and then I see that the New York Times won't even report the story because it's a game from the U.S. point of view. So in February 2014, the U.S. again engaged in a regime change operation and thought we can get away with it. Now we have a pro-NATO government. We've just overthrown the neutral government. Now we have a pro-NATO government. And immediately the new government says, yeah, we want to join NATO. And immediately the arms flows start from the United States, billions of dollars of arms flows. And this continues through Trump. It continues through the uprisings in the Donbass. It continues with Russia taking back Crimea. And then in 2021, we have a new president who some of us thought would be sane and responsible. He's probably sane, but he's completely irresponsible. And 3 times in 2021, the United States government recommitted to Ukraine's membership in NATO at the highest levels in big security documents, as well as in the NATO summit in 2021. And that's when Putin put on the table at the end of 2021 a draft agreement for new security arrangements between the US and Russia. And Putin kept saying, by the way, look, you're putting Aegis missiles in Poland and Romania. They're a few minutes from Moscow. What are you putting in those missile chambers? We don't even know, because you backed out of the ABM treaty, you backed out of the INF treaty. And so Putin's got a point. And now the US wants to move up to the 2,300 kilometer border with Russia. And for those who still think that this is, anyone who reads anything knows that this is a 30 years process. This is not about Putin reconstructing the Russian Empire. That's a nice little joke told by the US security state, as opposed to any of the things I've just described. But if you just go online and look at the Russian National Security Council meeting of February 21st, 2022, you get a perfectly plain explanation of what this military operation is about, because Putin goes around the room and calls on everybody, and calls on Lavrov, among others, and says, Minister Lavrov, what is the situation with our proposals for security arrangements? And Lavrov says, Mr. President, we put them on the table, And the United States has given us the formal notice that it will not negotiate on these points, and that as a formal principle, the United States will not discuss NATO enlargement with Russia because it's none of our business, because that is the formal foreign policy doctrine of the United States of America. Well, I can't think of a stupider one, by the way, to say that NATO enlargement, with all that it entails, up to Russia's border is none of Russia's business, so we don't even discuss it with Russia. Well, you might think a war could break out as a result of that, and it has.
I think the explanation is straightforward. The neocons are not interested in strategic balance or strategic stability. They're interested in global hegemony. They adopt and pursue the idea that the United States is, should be, and can remain the world's sole superpower. This is absurd in substance, because the United States is not, cannot, and should not be the world's sole superpower. The United States is 4.2% of the world population. It should do its share. It should be responsible. It should promote strategic balance, not hegemony, or what some in the US security state call full spectrum dominance. The neocons are not interested in balance. They are therefore actually undermining balance wherever it is. The whole reason for the war in Ukraine is the United States could not accept a mutually respectful peace with Russia. The United States had to keep moving NATO eastward to surround Russia. The United States does not accept a mutually respectful relationship with China. The United States wants to surround China with its military bases and military alliances. This is why the situation is so destabilizing, because the United States is not, and by the United States, by the way, I don't mean the US people, I mean the security state, which is dominated by this arrogance of unipolarity. They're not seeking stability, they're seeking dominance. And seeking dominance is not only, I think, immoral, but utterly impracticable, because the United States is not dominant. It is one of many powerful countries in the world, but there are many major powers in the world, and the United States seems intent to take them on. It won't succeed, but it will leave bloodshed, massive bloodshed, in the places that are trapped between the superpower fights, and Ukraine is the latest victim. It was a victim that was talked into its role by promises by the United States that we'll defeat Russia together. Of course, in the end, Russia is not defeated, but Ukraine is reduced to rubble. And this is unfortunately the American tendency.
Now, where do you think leaves us this insight, like for neutrality and non-alignment, especially for countries that are really kind of trying to be non-aligned, not this kind of lapdog neutrality that Austria and Switzerland and Ireland are going, because they have already been captured pretty much by the ideology, by the same ideology. But those states in Africa, South America, and India and Southeast Asia that don't want to go along, I mean, this puts a target on them as well, right? The United States will see any kind of third-party policy as inherently antagonistic. I mean, these neocons, the Victoria Nuland types.
Well, I think that from a strategic point of view, each region needs to get together so it's not picking off one country at a time, but actually regions cooperating. So I strongly advocate that ASEAN work together as a group. I advocate that the South American countries. Indeed, it would be good if the Latin American and Caribbean countries, but at least the regions, work together as a group. The United States approach is divide and conquer, the old strategy that dates back 2,000 years to the Roman Empire. So it picks off Venezuela, and then it divides Latin America between those who are on the U.S. side against Venezuela and those who are on the Venezuelan side. But what, of course, is the right response for Latin America is don't be divided that way. If you are divided that way, everybody loses. Millions of refugees from Venezuela that came from a brutal and premeditated attempt by the United States to overthrow the Maduro government. And who pays the consequences? All of the region, of course, Venezuela first in a shocking collapse of the economy and social life, but Colombia and other neighboring countries that have become home to millions of refugees from Venezuela. So I'm extremely happy, although it's very difficult, that Lula is back in the presidency in Brazil, because Lula can bring together the Latin American governments to say to the United States also, look, we're not your enemy, but stop dividing us, stop trying to overthrow governments in our region, because we don't want that. And that really needs to be the response everywhere. The United States traps countries in proxy wars, and those countries lose. I tried to tell my Ukrainian counterparts, they were at that time my Ukrainian friends, then they stopped listening to me and wanting to repudiate what I was saying, but I kept warning them, you are going to get trapped by the United States. And this is exactly what has happened.
Do you have any more hope for Taiwan? Because it seems to me the US is trying to do exactly the same now, with preparing Taiwan to be an unsinkable aircraft carrier and then have bloodshed on without end on Taiwan in order to fight a proxy war with China.
I was just in Taiwan. I was given a wonderful award called the Tang Prize by a fantastic foundation. I spoke to a major Buddhist foundation in Taiwan, the Tzu Chi Foundation. And what a wonderful society, what a successful place. And I gave the warning everywhere that I could, don't get trapped into this U.S. PRC fight, because this would be devastating. The United States basically is led by a lot of ignoramuses. I happen to know a lot of them. They're very poorly educated. They're educated in a kind of American arrogance. They are outdated by 30 years, thinking that the world is just at the U.S. doorstep, or that the U.S. has the prerogatives, I should say better, anywhere in the world. They don't know what they're doing. And I tried to say to Taiwanese leaders, be careful, because this is really what happened in Ukraine. Now, the U.S. approach is so mind-bogglingly wrong-headed. It says the way to protect a country is to arm it. Well, this is the fallacy that my late and great colleague at Columbia University, Robert Jervis, wrote about for decades, what he called the security dilemma. The United States may look at arming a country as a, quote, defensive action, but from the point of view of the country on the other side of that arming, that looks like a pretty aggressive action, and it therefore triggers a response. It triggers a retaliation. It makes conflict more likely. So the United States poured arms into Ukraine after 2014. It thought it was going to make peace that way. Well, yeah, maybe some of these dunderheads in Washington believed that, but of course it was leading towards conflict. And the idea that the way to protect Taiwan is by making Taiwan what they call in Washington a porcupine, so armed that it won't be touched with all those quills protecting it. This is absurd. The arms shipments would only make Taiwan more and more endangered, more and more at risk. The way to reduce, even eliminate these risks is diplomacy. Diplomacy between the United States and China, diplomacy between Taiwanese leaders and mainland Chinese leaders. Talk with each other. For heaven's sake, there is an absolute vital interest on both sides of the Taiwan Straits for peace. There really is. And if the United States would just get out of the way for a moment and the two sides could talk with each other, they'd actually find a way forward. But the United States comes in with its naive and destabilizing promises. We'll keep you safe. Yeah, they'll keep Taiwan safe like they kept Afghanistan safe, like they kept South Korea safe, like they kept Ukraine safe. In other words, not at all. And how many failures do these neocons, how many failures are they going to have before they are finally taken off the pedestal of power? By the way, it's not that the American people believe any of this. It's just that we don't have a functioning representative government. Our foreign policy has been taken in the hands of Raytheon and General Dynamics and these neocons. The American people are asked nothing about this. So this is not a reflection of the martial spirit of the American people, although our mainstream media feed a lot of absolute falsehoods to the American people. But it is the fact that foreign policy is in the hands of the security state, that is governed economically by the military-industrial complex, which funds the major committees in Congress, which provide the votes and the money for a $1 trillion plus annual military outlay. And that's where we are right now. It's absolutely awful. In the United States, foreign policy is the small preserve of the military-industrial complex.
I share that analysis with you. The oxymoron to me is that the United States keeps talking about itself. So, and I apologize again, the same people that you're talking about keep talking about the United States as a force for good and a force for peace, when in reality, the United States is highly militarized, highly militaristic, and reacts to conflict always with military components. That surprises me.
Well, I would add, I think since the end of the Second World War, the United States has been the most militarized and most violent country in the world. And this is just a matter of record. One recent scholarly account, a very good one, counted 70 US-led regime change operations between 1947 and 1989. So the study was over the Cold War period. And just in that period, 1947 to 1989, 70 regime change operations, 6 of which were overt wars to overthrow a foreign government, and 64 were covert operations. Now, this is stunning. First of all, covert operations don't remain covert. It's pretty obvious if you're a reader of the New York Times, which wants you to suck your thumb and go to sleep. But if you're a thinker who's looking at the actual evidence, pretty clear when the U.S. is covertly overthrowing another government like it tried to do in Syria. Now, the point is that this is the normal U.S. modus operandi: war, coups, and overthrows. And after 1989, the big change wasn't that the United States stopped that behavior. The big change was the United States thought it could get away with anything, whether in Iraq, in Afghanistan, in Syria, in 2011. Obama and Hillary, well, they decided, okay, we're going to overthrow Assad. That was just a conscious decision. And 12 years later, they left that country in shambles because they're fools. That what do they think? That they can dictate? By the way, they said, both Obama and Trump, okay, we're going to overthrow Maduro. We'll do it through economic sanctions. They crushed the economy. And as stupid as they are in Washington, they said, okay, we'll now pretend that Maduro's not the president. We'll just name another president from outside, Juan Guaido. And you have to think, is this a cartoon? Is this a fairy tale? Are these idiots that they think that from Washington they can name the president of Venezuela? But they actually tried to do this for several years. And I have friends in, well, they wouldn't call me friends, but in academia in the East Coast in the US that said, okay, I'm going to work for the new Guaido government. I said, Guaido government, because the US names him as president, he's suddenly president, you're going to work for him? Come on. So this is a deep and continuing tendency. The United States, it seems to me, forgot any kind of diplomacy. Diplomacy means you sit down and you negotiate mutual concerns. And by the way, to be successful, you show respect to the other side. And you try to listen to the concerns of the other side so that you can find a durable solution. That whole approach has completely gone. They don't even know how to negotiate. They have no interest in negotiating. They don't talk about it. This is amazing to me.
And there is actually a new study that shows that the rate of foreign intervention of the United States picked up after 1989 and didn't slow down. So the idea that the end of the Cold War would reduce interventions is actually wrong. This can be shown now. One last question to you. Reconciliation with Russia. You wrote recently a wonderful piece on your homepage about how Kennedy would have made peace, and I mean John F. Kennedy. And in that piece, though, supposes two things. One, Kennedy supposed that the US and USSR were equals, and two, he supposed that both states wanted to make peace. Now, it strikes me that both of these assumptions are not true anymore. Or do you think the US thinks of Russia as an equal and as somebody that they want peace with, unless it is with Russia in broken up?
Well, the neocons had a plan to try to either overthrow Putin or to so-called decolonize Russia. It's a vulgar thing. They didn't want to deal with Russia as a counterpart country for negotiations. On December 17, 2021, President Putin put on the table a draft US-Russia security agreement. This was the last off-ramp to avoid the Ukraine escalation in 2022. I urge the White House, talk now. Based on that document, there's a lot in there that's absolutely valid. Most importantly, stop the NATO enlargement to Ukraine, which has no sense and which is a Russian red line for completely understandable reasons. No, we don't talk to any third party about NATO, is the US refrain. That means we don't negotiate, we don't understand diplomacy, we don't recognize Russia's legitimate security concerns. And you end up with wars this way. Now, I continue to believe to this moment that if Biden said the words, we will recognize Russia's legitimate security concerns in a legitimate peace agreement that also respects Ukraine's sovereignty, that respects America's security interests and Russia's security interests, we could actually get to a negotiated peace. And pretty quickly, it would be based on Ukraine as a neutral country. A fact that Zelensky himself noted in a brief moment in 2022 until the United States told him to stop noting that and demanded that Ukraine shut down the negotiations. So Zelensky actually came back to what had been the basis of Ukraine's independence, the basis of its constitution, and the basis of an effective foreign policy for Ukraine neutrality. He came back to that. The United States tried to shut it down. Well, of course, the US policy is failing badly, not for the first time, for continuously failing, because this is American foreign policy, but it's destroying Ukraine in the process. Can the two sides, US and Russia, actually still end this through negotiations, this war? Of course they could, even today. I keep saying, to Biden, if you want to talk, I'll give you my Zoom link. You can make a Zoom link with Putin. Go ahead. You want to borrow my cell phone? Call him. Start negotiations. They're basically cowards in the US in the sense that they won't negotiate, because Kennedy put it right. He said, let us never negotiate out of fear, but let us never fear to negotiate. And they're afraid of negotiating in Washington, or they just forgot what it even means. So they don't have diplomats. I don't know what it is, but I've never seen anything like this. The absence of trying to find the way out of this disaster. And they need to open negotiations now.
Well, it's like the United States. What is democracy right now? It's a game of narratives and propaganda. So I think it's a shame. It's very sad what's happening right now. And the result is war in Ukraine, in which tens of thousands of people are being killed, actually every month now. And this is going on because the U.S. security state insists on it, and we know that just about every politician in Western Europe feels that you can't cross the United States because European security depends on it. There's been almost a complete elimination of the line between the European Union, which is a political and economic construction, and NATO. And it's not an accident that the headquarters of both NATO and the EU are in Brussels. I think it's a sad fact that Europe lost its way by confusing this military alliance, which is a US-led construction, with the political, cultural, social, and economic grouping of Europe, which is an aim to get the best of more than 2,000 years of culture in Europe. But now they're all confused. And I know that the European leaders simply will not cross the White House. Truly, I don't understand why, because none of this is in Europe's real interest. And many European leaders know better, but they're not talking. And what's happening in the media in Slovakia is happening all over the regions dominated by the U.S. And people are afraid. People are afraid of the United States government. People are afraid of the security state. People say, well, that's where our bread is buttered, or that's where our incomes come from, or that is where our security comes from. So we're not going to cross that. And it's terrible, because if people would understand recent history, what is this U.S. security state? It's the one that brought 20 years of destruction to Afghanistan. It's the one that brought the Iraq War. It's the one that destabilized Syria. It's the one that destabilized Libya. And it's the one that destabilized Ukraine, by the way. So people should see it with their own eyes. It's too bad. I want my country to do better, but I would have expected other countries to look at the facts as they are.
How do you think the conflict in Ukraine is developing, and how will it end?
Well, I think Ukraine is getting destroyed. I said at the beginning of this that the United States was going to turn Ukraine into Europe's Afghanistan. What did I mean by that? The United States went into Afghanistan in 1979. President Carter made a ordered the CIA to start funding the jihadists to try to overthrow the Afghan government. That was 44 years ago. And look at the result. The U.S. turned Afghanistan into a 40-year battlefield. And then one day it just left, because that's also the U.S. way. Same happened in Vietnam and in many other places. The whole thing with the U.S. is plenty of weapons, but as long as the U.S. isn't fighting there, they're content to keep sending weapons and keep having bloodshed. What's sad is that the Ukrainians are, for some reason, party to this. The Ukrainian leadership, we don't know what the Ukrainian people feel, because it's martial law, there's no elections, there's no asking. Now Zelensky said mobilization of every male in the society. Are they really going to just continue to throw away the lives of tens or hundreds of thousands of people for NATO enlargement? I don't know.
The American think tank Rand Corporation released a report on the post-war reconstruction of Ukraine. The United States and several Western European companies want to participate very actively in the restoration of Ukraine. You worked in Ukraine in the 1990s. You were an advisor during several transformations in Eastern European economies. How do you think is it possible to prevent this recovery from ending with the sale of Ukrainian companies?
No one is going to rescue Ukraine, believe me. There's going to be no Marshall Plan for Ukraine. There's going to be no hundreds of billions of dollars for Ukraine. This is all fantasy world, period.
And my last question, Mr. Professor, what is your explanation for the fact overall the sanctions did not put the Russian economy on hold? The war and sanctions are growing by less than 2%. According to the World Bank, Russia's economy is now the strongest in Europe and the fifth largest in the world. How is it possible?
Because most of the world does not agree with the U.S. and European Union. Shockingly, the Americans and the Europeans don't understand this because our media don't tell the truth. But my job is to work all over the world, mainly in the developing countries, in Africa, in Latin America, in South Asia, in East Asia, in Central Asia. Nobody believes in the official story that this is unprovoked Russian aggression against Ukraine. Everybody knows this is about the U.S. and Russia, NATO enlargement, U.S. power. This is what people know. So governments around the world didn't stop doing business with Russia. That's it. If they had, the sanctions would have had a much bigger effect. But Russia's actively trading all over Asia, all over Latin America, all over Africa. And the sanctions regime is just the US, EU, UK, Japan, Korea, Singapore. That's it. And the rest of the world is doing its business. And our media can't understand this because their job is to report the US government narrative, which is that the whole world is united against Russia. Well, nonsense. This is exactly why these sanctions didn't work. By the way, the sanctions didn't work for a simple reason, which is not only does most of the world want to continue to have normal economic relations with Russia, but it's not so hard to have arrangements that don't involve U.S. banks. You just use other people's banks. That's the story. And so settling in rubles or settling in renminbi or settling in some other currency is not rocket science. It's just if you're not a friend of the United States, keep your money out of U.S. dollars because they may take the money away. That's the lesson. And so Russia's now dealing in non-dollar transactions.
For last 3 years, you are being consulted because of the COVID, because of the Ukraine war, etc. But predominantly, you are an economist. Yes, so we would like to take advantage of your economist knowledge. And you quite often mention that there's the de-dollarization threat. That it's clear that the de-dollarization will happen. So the question is, especially in the terms of huge United States inner debt, what will be the causes of de-dollarization for the United States? And what are the causes of de-dollarization for the Western economics, which are closely joined, which really depend on the United States economy?
I think there are two different issues for people to understand. One is the so-called real economy, what different parts of the world produce, the technologies that they have, the trade in goods and services, the innovations. And the second is the financial side, how transactions are made, in which currency, in which institutions, banks, or through the internet, and so forth. And the point that I'm making broadly is that on the second dimension, the role of the dollar will diminish over time for two main reasons. One is that it's not safe for any country that is not in good foreign relations with the United States to keep its reserves in dollars, because the U.S. has basically militarized the dollar. If you're an enemy of the United States, the U.S. will confiscate your foreign exchange reserves in Venezuela, in Iran, in Afghanistan, in Russia. So the United States didn't say, oh, we protect the property rights. We may have disagreements, but we protect the property. Quite the contrary. The United States said, we're freezing all of Russia's financial assets. And not just that, quite interestingly, if you're a friend of Putin, whatever that means, I don't know what that means in a court of law, but we're going to take your apartments, we'll take your financial assets, we'll freeze your bank accounts. It's really amazing to me because the United States is supposed to be the place that protects property rights. So the first thing is that lots of governments, especially the governments not friendly with the United States, are trying to find a different way to settle transactions, and they're smart to do so. The second thing that's happening is that the normal way in general of settling transactions, which is through banks, is going to diminish because of digital currencies, because of the ability to have central bank digital currencies. I think this will make a big difference. It's only at the beginning, so it's a little bit hard to say the timing, but I do believe that there will be direct settlements using basically central bank direct settlement mechanisms rather than going through commercial banks, which is much more laborious. But we went through banks for hundreds of years because that was the only alternative. Now with the internet and with all of the paraphernalia around digital finance, we can do it in a much more efficient way.
Well, if the demilitarization of dollar happened under different administrative, under different president, do you think that that dollarization can slow down, the dollar can remain the first class currency for other tens or hundreds of years?
Not for hundreds of years, certainly, but there is normally a very gradual change in settlements processes because of network externalities, so-called, which means people use dollars because other people use dollars. So the dollar has a certain staying power. The U.S. is wrecking it by its foreign policy right now. It's shocking to me how they're taking measures that are directly wounding the role of the dollar, because I wouldn't have done at all what the U.S. government has done in freezing assets and seizing assets and so forth. But still, the dollar remains because there's a lot of infrastructure. There is the big network. There is a lot of financial expertise. But the U.S. is also, over time, declining as a share of the world economy. The sterling, the pound sterling, was the dollar of the 19th century. It was unthinkable that there would be anything other than the pound sterling. Now, what's the pound sterling? It's a footnote in history. It's still used in Britain, but who cares? It plays basically no role in the international system. And someday that will be the situation with the US dollar, because the US is only 4% of the world population. So it can't really be the center of the world the way that American strategists want it to be and believe it to be. But the dollar could remain for quite a while, not on our current policy, though.
Well, let's discuss the BRIC, because BRIC, and it's nearly forgotten right now, was created as the toy, as the mental toy of Western academics. First of all, it used to be just an acronym in 2001. But now it's emancipated, it's strong, it seems to be the new economic integration, and there are some discussions about the enlargement of that. So first of all, do you think that Western academics really intend to create this very self-confidence integration? And secondly, do you think that it can be really enlarged unless it was harmed by the enlargement?
Originally, the BRICS was the idea that, boy, there's a lot of good places to invest in a diversified portfolio because you have these emerging economies and they're growing, they're adopting technologies. So it was a Goldman Sachs invention, not a Jeffrey Sachs invention, but the bank Goldman Sachs. It was basically a reflection of the emergence of the emerging markets. But then it became political. The BRICS started to meet with each other: Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa. Now, why? Because they had one major thing in common other than being emerging economies, and that was they didn't want the U.S. as the hegemonic power. It was really annoying for all of them to have the United States say, we're the world leader, we're the sole superpower, we're the indispensable country, we make the rules-based system. Which rules? Our rules. So that's what united the BRICS, was annoyance, actually, with the arrogance of U.S. liberal hegemonists or neocons. They made the BRICS. Actually, even it's interesting that Zbigniew Brzezinski, who was a very clever strategist for the U.S. power, wrote, when he wrote The Global Chessboard in 1997, he said, the one unthinkable thing is for the U.S. to push Russia and China together. But because of American arrogance, that's exactly what America did every day, step by step, for the next 25 years. And that's what made the BRICS. And I think that's what basically unites the BRICS. On the one side, they're united because, well, they're important economies, and the BRICS are now larger than the G7 in purchasing power measured terms. So that's a big deal. But I think the other thing is geopolitical, which is the BRICS really say, we're big powers. We want a multipolar world. We don't want the U.S. surrounding us with military bases. That's the Russian view. That is the Chinese view. Brazil says, come on, don't interfere in South America the way you do, saying we're going to overthrow the Venezuelan government, which was another stupid U.S. idea of the last 10 years. And so Brazil, in a different way, because it's not a superpower like China or Russia, it's not a nuclear power, but it still says, give some space to our region. We don't want the U.S. dictating to us. China's quite interesting because China triangulates. I don't mean China, sorry, India. India is quite interesting because India really triangulates. They have their tensions, even border disputes, of course, with between India and China. And the United States says, okay, we'll be your partner. You just have to oppose China. But India is also, of course, a great civilization. It was colonized by Britain for centuries. And it's not about to say, yes, United States, you run the world. So India fits in this mold in a very interesting way as well, basically as the world's most populous country that wants to have its global say. So what the BRICS really represent is the call for multipolarity as opposed to a US-led world. Europe somehow just wanted to duck under the blanket, and have the U.S. protection, which is very surprising to me because Europe has been very naive in recent years, especially regarding Ukraine. It's accepted huge economic costs without any strategic thinking because the U.S. said so, and we'll see how that evolves.
Seen from the West, Western Europe, or probably even the United States, the BRICS seems to be nowadays something as the black box. So now there's minimum of contact between the Western academic sphere and BRICS universities, minimum contact between the Ministry of Finance, central banks, etc. You've mentioned the Goldman Sachs, probably even JP Morgan and the others. Can you see some attempts of infiltration of these old Bretton Woods organizations, old banks, houses, as they wanted to infiltrate the BRICS institutions, the BRICS academic circles, because BRICS now really wants to be the number one, yeah? So I can't imagine that Goldman Sachs wouldn't try to be in close, deep touch on this process.
Well, look, the Wall Street very much has a presence and wants an even bigger presence in China. It wants a presence in India and so on. Russia is another matter because stupidly for the moment, all economic connections were lost and cut, which is a shame. I believe they'll come back because you can't just close your eyes and say that a country of 11 time zones and a nuclear superpower doesn't exist, but that's the attitude right now. In fact, there's lots of connection. Where the breakdown is occurring is at the political level. The companies would like to have ongoing normal relations with China, but the United States is saying, no, we have to go into a containment mode. We're going to scrutinize your investments. If a U.S. company invests in China, it's considered unpatriotic or maybe threatening U.S. security. This is the change, really. And there's lots of interchange over the last 30 years between U.S. and Chinese scholars and lots of Chinese students studying in the United States and Europe. But the U.S. is cutting that too. All of this is bad for the U.S. and Europe. All of this fear, protectionism, hostility is an own goal. It's a self-imposed cost, but it comes from this U.S. idea that either we're number one or we're going to fight to stop you from being so powerful, and it's leading to a very tense breakdown of relations that existed, and that still exist to an important extent, but are now under a very dark cloud. And so if you have good relations with China, oh, the eyebrows are raised in the United States. What are you doing? Something improper, and so on. And Europe is increasingly playing with this, which is ridiculous because Europe and China are partners in Eurasia. Europe and China have every reason to cooperate, with each other, to trade with each other. The Silk routes are not an imaginary idea. They go back 2,000 years, east-west trade. And but Europe is parroting, or at least Brussels is parroting the U.S. line right now. And the U.S. idea of NATO expanding to East Asia, I have to put as the #1 dumbest idea that I've heard. You know, for NATO to open an office in Tokyo, for example. What are we possibly thinking? And how could Europe, which is filled with such intelligent people, ever go along with this idea? I don't know.
Probably the last question. There's a wide discussion about the BRICS currency unit, new currency unit, artificial currency unit. Is there something that the BRICS as the integration can get inspired by Europe, by special drawing rights? Probably how to avoid the mistakes and the deep errors of them. What should be the design of such unit?
I doubt that there will be a BRICS currency anytime soon, but what I do believe is that there will be a non-dollar, non-euro settlements system that the BRICS countries will use. Maybe they'll settle a lot in renminbi, maybe they'll settle in Indian rupees, they will settle some in rubles, they may establish financial institutions with extensive swap lines between the central banks, kind of a quasi-IMF that would help to ensure liquidity among the trading partners within the BRICS and a broader network. But a single currency, I doubt it. One could say, by the way, that there could be something like a BRICS SDR, which is a unit of account. It's a basket. It can serve certain purposes, but it's not really a settlements currency, and it's not really an active transactions currency. So one could imagine something like that, but I don't think we're going to see an actual currency that you can look at or hold in your account that's and use for transactions that's a BRICS currency anytime soon. Maybe I'm out of date and it's going to happen faster, but I think it'll be much more likely that, excuse me, on our phones we'll be able to settle in renminbi, or we'll be able to settle in rupees or reales, rather than a single BRICS currency. The United States basically, at every step, kept saying to the Russian leadership, you don't count for anything. We don't have to listen to you about anything. And eventually, all of the goodwill dissipated. Basically, this is a war of NATO enlargement because Ukraine is the borderland. It's the word Ukraine. It means the border. It's the borderland between East and West in countless ways. It's the border between Catholic and Protestant on the one side versus Orthodox on the other side. It's the border between the Russian Empire and the Austrian and Polish, Lithuanian, and German states on the other side. It's always been the divide. The Dnieper River is the divide, basically. And so this is a difficult place that needs to be handled with care. But the United States took the view that Ukraine is a prize for the West. And even though Ukraine itself was deeply divided ethnically, linguistically, religiously, historically, in public opinion, the United States kept wanting it all. So it kept pushing for Western control over NATO and saying that any Russian concern, whether it's economic links, military links, family links, linguistic links, ethnic links, those don't count for anything. Those are just the old bad Russian Empire. And the US blew off any Russian concerns about Ukraine, even though the United States is how many thousand miles away, and Russia, on the other hand, is the border of 2,000 kilometers. The US is extremely arrogant as well as ignorant about all of this. So basically, from the mid-1990s onward, the US plan was Ukraine is ours. And the real meaning of that was NATO, but together with the European Union membership. And those are seen as a package more and more, because NATO and the European Union are almost the same thing in the strategist mentality. If they were really separate, the world would be different, but they're not. They're both headquartered in Brussels, and they're both the same package deal, basically. So the US kept intervening in Ukrainian internal affairs. It kept basically siding with Ukrainian nationalists. It kept pushing for NATO membership, and it did that in 2004, the so-called Orange Revolution. It did it then most disastrously in 2008 at the Bucharest NATO summit, where Bush pushed for NATO enlargement to Ukraine, even though the Europeans told him how dangerous it is. But of course, the Europeans don't dare say in public what they say in private. So we don't have a true accounting of that, but I know it to be the case, and others know it too. And then the real fuse was lit, or detonated even. The bomb was detonated with the overthrow of Yanukovych in 2014. Yanukovych, in my view, was trying a difficult balancing act, pulled on the one side by the US, pulled on the other side by Russia. He wanted neutrality. He was responding to both sides. Ukraine had big governance problems, big financial problems, and each side pulling at Ukraine. And eventually, in my interpretation, the US sided with the Russophobic Ukrainian nationalists to overthrow Yanukovych in February 2014. And I know some of the story, but we don't know the full story, because other than Victoria Nuland being caught on tape, the US keeps quiet about its covert operations. But my view is the US was deeply involved in the overthrow of Yanukovych, didn't lift a finger to help even to stabilize the situation. It just helped to install a Russophobic government. And then when violence broke out in the Donbass, and the evidence is really that was not Russian instigated, it was instigated by Ukrainian Russians, not by Russia. But when the demands in the Donbass for protection broke out, Russia pushed for the Minsk agreements, and Merkel and Hollande said, yes, we'll help guarantee them. And then the United States said, don't worry about it, just forget it. And the Ukrainians also said, forget it. So the US plan was, we'll arm Ukraine enough that it will become a fait accompli, that Ukraine will become a NATO country and a European Union country, and Russia won't be able to do anything about it. So I think they really believed, what can Russia do? You know, it's a backwater, it's weak. We don't believe Putin's threats. If he actually does something, we'll sanction the economy to death. So they were playing a game of chicken, and Putin called their bluff and invaded in February after the US refused to negotiate anything. And interestingly, almost days after Zelensky said, oh, we should negotiate. And the Russians and the Ukrainians actually sat down and negotiated in Ankara and almost reached an agreement. And then the United States intervened, said, you don't have to reach an agreement. We're going to crush Russia. And you're going to do it for us, Ukraine. You're going to be heroes. You're going to defeat Russia with our wonderful weapons and our economic sanctions. And of course, this was an illusion, typical American arrogance, because Putin mobilized in the middle of 2022. And also, Russia was a far more capable military and far more capable arms manufacturer than the United States allowed, and technologically much more sophisticated than they imagined, with very smart guided missiles and a lot of advanced digital technologies. And so Putin escalated. And now we can see, we don't know the outcome of this, but of course, Ukraine is being bloodied tragically. Probably, you know, it's said 40,000 dead in the last 2 months. I don't know whether those estimates are accurate or not, but you can see the West doesn't care at all about the loss of life in Ukraine. It just says, here, have some more weapons and go to it. Keep going. And no matter how big the bloodshed, the U.S. view is, well, they're the ones dying. We're not dying. It's our weapons. And we're selling a lot and our companies like it. So this is a bluff that was called, a kind of game of chicken, and Russia showed that it could keep escalating, and the West has no plan because it thought it could get away with things. Going back to February 2014, the idea was we'll put in a new government and Ukraine will join the West. That's it. And then Putin grabbed Crimea as he had threatened to do. Oh, that's a surprise. And then the Minsk. Oh, that's a surprise. So the West keeps getting surprised. And Biden has been there all along, playing an important role in this. And I think he's just a very bad strategist. And he's put Ukraine into a terrible, terrible disaster. And my expression at the beginning of this war was that the U.S. is going to make Ukraine into a European Afghanistan, because the U.S. wrecked Afghanistan for 40 years, destroyed that country mercilessly, cynically, ignorantly, brutally. And they're going to do the same with Ukraine unless the Ukrainians wake up and say, God, we're being killed by this approach, which is what they should have woken up about a long time ago. And I'll tell you, by the way, the ultimate issue in Africa, although part of it is still getting, ending the French colonial era in these countries, but the real issue in these countries in the Sahel is they're the poorest place in the world, and nobody in Europe or the US gives a damn. That's the real story here. Because I've been to these countries for years and years. The impoverishment is intense. And if you go back and say to the US or Europe, this is really important that you do something about the poverty, they laugh at you. Why should we care about the Sahel? Are you kidding? This is the biggest backwater of the whole planet, they'll tell you. And then they find out situation's not too happy there. But this is really an example of the unbelievable disdain that the rich world has for the poor world. Because these wars are basically, this war in Niger is basically a war of impoverishment, because they have nothing there. And that I've seen all over the place. Yemen was another example where when I went, I was shocked at the poverty and at the threat of instability in 2009. And I went back to Washington and I was laughed at. What's the matter with you? Why do you care about such a stupid, hopeless place? Is the reception that I got. It's the same thing with Niger or Burkina Faso or Mali. So these are kind of deep, deep crises that reflect a world powers that don't give a damn. I'm talking about the Western powers.
But just to say that this conflict, in a way, started 100 years ago. It started after World War I. Britain, in its typical way, promised this land to several different groups, all in typical British cynicism, including a Jewish homeland, an Arab state, promised to the French a mandate, you name it. But basically, we've been, since the end of World War I and the end of the Ottoman Empire, on the question, what is to happen with this land between the Jordan River and the Mediterranean Sea. And in 1947 and 48, the UN, which just got formed, had the idea of a partition between a Jewish state and a Palestinian state. And Israel accepted it. The Palestinian and Arab side said it wasn't a fair deal. A war ensued when Israel unilaterally declared its independence. Israel won that war, and a state of Israel was established, but no state of Palestine was established. Then in 1967, with the June 1967 war, Israel took military control over the Palestinian territories as well, meaning East Jerusalem, the West Bank territory, and Gaza. And we've been in that situation since 1967, where Israel has military control over the three areas of what would be Palestine. Now, international law, as reflected in the UN Security Council and UN General Assembly for basically 57 years, has said there needs to be two states living in peace side by side. I agree with that, certainly. And international law says that should be along the borders of the 4th of June, 1967. And I agree with that proposition as well. But starting in the early 1970s, Israel began to settle in the conquered territories. It claimed East Jerusalem for its own country, essentially annexing it, saying that a unified Jerusalem is permanent, and it put hundreds of thousands of settlers, or allowed hundreds of thousands of settlers, or a combination of the two, into the occupied West Bank, and some into Gaza, though the situation in Gaza is more complicated. But essentially, Israel settled in the occupied territories. And the idea from the secular point of view was make a two-state solution impossible, basically, other than one that Israel would control or dominate. But what happened starting in the 1970s is that these settlers got a mind of their own, and these are, to a very significant extent, religious zealots, not all of them, but many of them, who say, well, God gave us all this land. We have the right to permanently dominate the Palestinian people. This is a view that I think most of the world would not accept, and the secular world would not accept. But it is a big part of the problem now, because over time, this zealous religious movement, an extreme nationalist movement that says all of this land is for the Jews, became the dominant part of Israeli politics. So what's happening in Gaza right now is not a war on Hamas to limit the danger from Hamas, which is actually much more limited than Israel claims. but it is actually a war on the Palestinian people and on the idea of an independent state of Palestine, because this government in Israel and a large part of the population now says, no, there will be one state. It will be Israel. We will control everything. But the whole rest of the world doesn't agree with that. And they shouldn't agree with that. We need two states living side by side in accordance with international law. And my own view is that religious zealotry, based on a 6th century BC text of the Bible, should not dominate. What we need is what the international community has said for more than half a century is right: two states living side by side. And I advocate that the UN Security Council should impose that solution. Now, it should vote today, as far as I'm concerned, for an independent, sovereign state of Palestine based on the 4th June 1967 borders. And let's get on with it. Now, there's two obstacles. One is Israel, obviously, and its politics. The other is the United States. Israel has one backer in this present situation, which is the U.S. This is complicated because the U.S. political system and public do not buy into the greater Israel idea. They buy into a safe and secure Israel. But the U.S. has always supported the two-state solution. But politically, the U.S. is the backer that arms Israel, that is enabling Israel, that is actually complicit with Israel in carrying out this massacre in Gaza and this basically this ethnic cleansing operation in Gaza. And my very specific recommendation is the United States should say to Israel, look, you know, we don't agree with you, and we're not going to arm you for this purpose. Because if the U.S. stops the military support for Israel, Israel can't do this an extra day. Not even an extra day. And so there is a way for this war to stop, very practically. There is a political outcome. And that's what I think we should move to.
You mentioned, I think, the vast majority of the UN member states shared and they support it. And the problem is that the real power at the UN, in the UN system, is just with the Security Council. And as long as the Security Council has one, sometimes a second, maybe even with Britain, it was only because Britain is the source of the problem, because this was their colonial power. But how to move there? I think let's become precise. I think you presented really a plan with point 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. I assume that many people know it, but please give a short view what the main points of your plan. It starts with the full membership of Palestine to the UN, a full membership, because as an observer they have been already, but full membership is something else. Could you just summarize your proposals?
So my basic idea is we don't need more process. We don't need more 10 years of negotiation. We don't need another Oslo process. There's no way to say more about this issue than has been said for the last 50 years. We have to understand that the two parties cannot solve this by themselves. Each one is locked into its own extremism, and there's zero trust between the two sides, to say the least. So in this case, we have an international community that is essentially united on this, with one crucial footnote, which is the United States has blocked this approach for decades, even though it is, quote, in favor of this approach. Even Biden said a couple of weeks ago, we support the two-state solution. But the United States political system has given essentially a blank check to Israel for decades so that it murmurs support for the two-state solution, but it does not enforce it. American politicians have long believed for decades that support for Israel is vital for their political health because they have believed that that's where the big campaign contributions come from. That's in line with the military-industrial complex system, which is politically quite powerful. And they believe that's where public opinion is. But in the U.S., public opinion has turned against Israel because the American people do not want to be complicit in this massacre. And they are not supportive of the so-called Greater Israel, which means Israel dominance over Palestine. They are supportive of two states. Every opinion survey for decades has demonstrated this. That's true of American Jews, by the way, not just of the American public generally. We're not so far from that because the Security Council is basically 13 to 1 to 1. That is 13 countries support what I'm saying. One opposes it, the United States, and one always goes along with the U.S. That's the UK. Shame on them. First of all, they should grow up. Second, they should recognize they're no longer a world empire. And third, they should take some responsibility for the mess that they left. So, but aside from that, that's a footnote as far as I'm concerned. The real story here is the U.S. And I'm trying to say to U.S. public officials, look, you're completely alone supporting something you don't even support. So you have to do something more creative. Now, unfortunately, President Biden's not creative. He lacks the energy and insight. His foreign policy team is extremely weak. So I don't know whether we'll get there or not. But the domestic politics and the international politics is all pushing in the same direction. Now, what would it mean? To my mind, instead of a new political process, it starts with the outcome. Two states, 1967 borders. Now let's implement that. Second stage, obviously, would be that on that basis, there would be a regional agreement. The Arab states would say we end our state of belligerence or hostility with Israel. We normalize relations. We stop supporting Hamas or other anti-Israel militia groups. We stop funding them. We start arming them. We stop giving political backing to them. That can happen. Why do I say it can happen? Because the Arab and Islamic countries have said so repeatedly. And they said it recently in Riyadh when they met in an emergency meeting after October 7 and the subsequent Israeli invasion of Gaza. So that's the second step, is the diplomatic political step. That includes Iran, by the way, because it's not only the Arab states, it's also Iran, which is, of course, a backer of Hezbollah and Hamas. But that's possible, too. But we have to also stop the hostility to Iran, which was agreed with the JCPOA agreement several years ago. And then the United States broke that. And by the way, broke it in part because of Israeli pressure. So, this was Israel pushing the U.S. to break an agreement signed with Iran. And Europe, as usual, was pitiful. It just stood by and mumbled because European leaders are afraid of the United States instead of telling the United States the truth. So this is another part of it. But anyway, second step is normalizing the diplomatic relations based on the two states. Third step is actually putting in peacekeepers. And the best that I've heard is that this peacekeeping force, which would operate under the mandate of the UN Security Council, would include Americans, would include troops that are drawn from
the Arab countries. And the idea would be to create a buffer zone that would protect Israel from incursions like occurred on October 7. And on the basis of this political solution, would also demobilize the armed side of Hamas step by step, and would show basically that Hamas, which is a political, a military, and a cultural force, the military side would be ended as part of a political settlement. And this would be the next step. The step after that would be actually to promote economic recovery and development after this devastation. There's a lot to be said about this. It's tragic and a measure of human stupidity that in a world that needs so much, the first thing we do is destroy and then have to spend huge amounts simply to rebuild what we destroyed in a matter of days or weeks. But there is a reality now that Israel has destroyed the habitability of Gaza. Oh my God. Well, we're going to have to address this. And so this is another reality that needs to be added to the scene. But my basic point is move to a solution, not to an illusion, not to the status quo, not to what Israel wants right now, which is not to talk about the day after, because we know what Israel wants the day after. They murmur it every few days, which is complete control, which is absolutely unacceptable. Not to talk about, oh, we need to reestablish the Palestinian National Authority, blah, 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 because this is all fake. What we need to do is spell out where the solution is. 2 states, international law, living side by side, and with peacekeepers, and disarming the threats to both sides. And this is a very practical set of steps that could be reached. And I think it's not impossible. There are big issues, by the way, that I don't have an answer to. There are hundreds of thousands of Israelis who would be dead set against what I'm saying. They are settling illegally in the West Bank, many of them based on a religious fervor that they think comes from the book of Joshua from the 6th century BC. We're going to have to address this. Addressing it in human terms may mean addressing it gradually over a few years, not violently and brutally. These are human beings, in my view, completely misguided and illegal in their actions. But that needs to be addressed too. So I don't want to pretend, obviously, that I have a step-by-step solution to everything. But the point is, we've got to stop faking what's going on right now. The answer has been known for decades. But Israel has become more and more radical. And this is very sad. It's become more and more messianic in its politics. This is weird for the 21st century, but it's actually happened. So I want us to look straightforwardly, clearly at what's going on and understand this is not normal debate about security and so forth. This is about whether there's going to be peace and 2 states, or whether there's going to be an Israeli attempt to dominate millions of Palestinians, or brutally suppress them, or brutally ethnically cleanse them, or kill a lot of them. And to my mind, the only possible alternative, and the one that the whole world agrees to, is to give political self-determination to Palestine. By the way, there was a vote on that in the General Assembly recently, quite interesting. Every country in the world
that voted yes, except for four. The four were Israel, the United States, Micronesia, country of 113,000 people last time I checked, and Nauru, a country of 12,000 people. So basically, the whole world has said, get on with it.